Hello everyone and welcome to the MoeGamer podcast. This is the pilot episode of this podcast that will hopefully become a regular thing very soon. I'm Pete Davison from MoeGamer.net and I'm joined by my good friend and longtime supporter Chris Caskie, which I've learned today is not Chris Caskie.
Yes.
Which hadn't even crossed my mind. So, for those of you who are coming to this podcast without having stumbled across my site, first of all, I'm a former games journalist. I used to work on US Gamer, Game Pro, and a few other sites you probably haven't heard of before that. And now I write about Japanese games and visual novels all the time. As for Chris, I'll let him introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. My name's Chris Caskie. I'm a artist and writer based out of southeastern Pennsylvania in the USA. I have not done anything anybody's probably aware of, but I do share my own artwork at mrgilderpixels.com, where I dabble in paintings, classic style digital pixel art, and some of my own digital and old school sketches, drawings, etc. So make sure to check that out if you have the chance. And I also like to talk about video games all day, every day.
Excellent. His stuff's very good if you haven't checked it out before, so do make sure you check it out and give him money for it as well. So, there we go. Get the plug-in out of the way first. Wonderful. All right. Okay, so we're going to start our discussion today with talking a bit about some of the recent news with both our respective interests. This is probably going to have a bit of a bias towards sort of the Japanese and Japanese-inspired games, so if you're looking for AAA goodness, then go elsewhere, basically. All right, so the first thing I wanted to bring up then is so Sega recently announced that they are going to be doing an HD re-release of Shenmue 1 and 2, which people have been crying about for a long time. For some reason on my Twitter account, I've had a Save Shenmue account harassing me for about the last 5 years or so, but it seems that either that finally came to fruition or Sega has decided this all along. Silicon Era posted a few new screenshots from the HD remake, and well, what are your thoughts?
Well, this is probably where I begin making enemies, like right off the bat in the first episode of the podcast, but I'm thrilled about the Shenmue remake from a historical perspective and from an archiving and accessibility perspective. But in terms of actually playing Shenmue again, I have no desire to do so. I've never really been a big fan. And I think this is going to be an opportunity for people to really face the rose-tinted nostalgia glasses a bit and realize that those games were quite unintuitive and not nearly as fun as they think they are. But
I do have some fairly vivid memories of back in the day when it first came out, of everyone raving about it, and I spoke to my brother about it, and he said it was, in his opinion, it was one of the most boring games that he'd ever played, because it was just about rummaging in cupboards and stuff.
Yeah.
But then I picked it up and I quite enjoyed it, because it was, I mean, for all its faults, and it is quite boring, but I feel like a certain element of that is deliberately so, and I found the idea of a highly interactive world like that to be really interesting, and it's going to be interesting to revisit that from a modern perspective, I think, because we do have sort of super detailed worlds now in a lot of our games, but they tend to sort of err on the side of not being that interactive, if you know what I mean.
Sure,
so
sure.
I don't know if you remember, there was a fashionable term a while back called the immersive sim. People like Warren Spector and that were big into this.
Sure.
It was the idea of having a game with a world that you could wander around and you could sort of pick up objects and chuck them around, and there was usually a physics engine involved, so you could sort of fling dead bodies around the place and that sort of thing. And Shenmue, I think, was an early example of that. Sort of almost taken to an extreme, I think. Like, you didn't need to be able to open every cupboard and look at all the white shirts and pairs of jeans that Ryo had, but on the whole, I think it was a game that I liked, and I'm certainly interested to revisit it and see if it's any better. And one thing I am definitely looking forward to is being able to play it without that atrocious dub.
Listen. That's one thing I do fondly remember. I do not know a man named Londi, and that is the end of that. No, but you know, the thing about Shenmue, without going on too long about it, is although I'm not the world's hugest fan, like I like to make a very clean division between games I respect and games I actually want to play. And from a historical perspective, in terms of design, ambition, and what it tried to do, which was essentially completely new, nothing but the utmost respect for Shenmue, which is I don't have a desire to go back and play Shenmue 1 and 2. But as I mentioned earlier, I'm delighted that it's going to be something that exists for people.
Yeah, definitely.
For people to get their hands on and to explore from a design perspective. And I think there's a lot of lessons that can be learned from Shenmue, especially in terms of, as you kept mentioning, being able to open every cupboard, being able to interact with things. One of my greatest gripes, and I know you share this, we've talked about it in the past, about modern AAA games is they can, large, completely explorable worlds is now part and parcel of everyday gaming, but these worlds are still incredibly empty, especially in a AAA open world style game, things like Assassin's Creed. They fill these worlds with beautiful things, but you still can't do anything with them. Like, fire up Call of Duty and unload your machine gun on an office chair. Like, the office chair doesn't get damaged, it doesn't react with physics. So something as old as Shenmue still had this world where we could walk into a home, open cupboards, go to a capsule toy machine, interact with it. This level of immersion is something that we don't have, even though games are bigger and more beautiful than they were in Shenmue's day. So there's a lot of design lessons that can be learned from playing with it. Even if it isn't the most fun thing to play today, it's still a really fascinating piece of design history.
Yeah, definitely. What do you... I'm conscious we've spent a while talking about this already, but what would you say to the people who say that the Yakuza series is a successor to Shenmue? Do you agree with that, or do you think that's a different track?
No, I'm very much in line with that degree of thinking, and I think my experience with the Yakuza series is not incredibly deep, but... what I find about it is that it takes many of the things I liked about Shenmue, that explorability, and most importantly, which I think is the real heart of Shenmue, is being in a lived-in world that you get to participate in everyday life of. Yeah. Which that's integral to the Yakuza games too. It takes that and adds what I always found missing from Shenmue, which is actual mechanics and fun arcadey combat, and a world that's not only fun to be in, but a world that's fun to play in as well. And I always felt that second part, fun to play in, was what was missing from Shenmue.
Yeah, definitely. I think Yakuza sort of trims a lot of the fat. So I mean, it's got this world and it's got interactivity, but it doesn't overdo it. So it doesn't have you going out to work and doing a job and stuff. Although there is sort of stuff that you can do repeatedly, like the sort of hostess side quests and the running the bars and that sort of thing. But that's all optional. The thing in Shenmue is that fucking forklift truck driving bit. You had to do that for 2 in-game weeks to be able to progress the story, and it was just a nightmare.
No, it's I have to do that. I have to work garbage jobs I don't want to work in order to play games and have fun in my real life. I don't really need that.
Yeah.
Although, to be fair, I will defend No More Heroes up and down for forcing you to do the same thing. So I guess I'm a hypocrite, but that's a discussion for another time.
Yeah, it works for some things, I'm sure. All right, I'm going to hand over to you. Is there something you want to talk about?
Recently released on Steam, there's a really interesting game called Land of Glass, which I thought was really cool looking. I haven't gotten a chance to play it yet, but what it essentially is a tactical card battle game with a really interesting hook, being that it actually functions in real time, which is abnormal for a card battle game. It doesn't pause to let you make your decisions. It's not turn-based, which is very unique. So you kind of have to make flash strategic decisions, which I thought was interesting. It also has a very beautiful stained glass aesthetic across everything. The characters, the environments, it's wholly dedicated to replicating that look. Which I thought was unique. It has a very strange visual profile. So I don't know if I'll have time to check that anytime soon, but I encourage anybody to check that out. Once again, it's called Land of Glass by Dual Wield Software, and it's currently available on Steam. Really artistically interesting, and sounds like it has some cool design decisions going on.
Yeah, it's quite interesting to see the card battle thing combined with. I'm going mostly on screenshots here, but it sort of looks like it's sort of gone with a sort of almost sort of Bastion style viewpoint. I mean, it describes it as collectible card game meets action RPG. So there's obviously some sort of. I'm struggling to make out what the images are showing me, really, but I guess there's going to be like movement and sort of doing things in real time, like you say.
Yeah.
But that all being dependent on your cards.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know how familiar you are with the Growlancer series, but it kind of strikes me as being a lot like Growlancer. In Battle in Growlancer, the characters almost walked around the stage with AI, with like in an RTS kind of way, and then once they met, you would make menu selections for the combat, and it seems to be a bit like that.
Okay, that sounds interesting. Yeah, the one thing I wouldn't want from a card battle one is, did you ever play the Kingdom Hearts Game Boy Advance game?
No, I haven't.
That had the weirdest combat system ever. Like, just doing a basic attack, you had to have the right card in your hand and all sorts. It was weird. So it doesn't look like it's going to be like that, but that's sort of my benchmark of what not to do when you're combining a card game with something else.
Have you ever played Monolith Soft, the Baten Kaitos games?
I haven't, no.
Those are a bit like that. It's a standard turn-based RPG, but everything's driven by cards. So like when it's your character's turn, they draw a hand of cards, and then like if you have a shield in your hand, you can defend, or if you have, if you draw your magic attack, you can use that. But I rather like those games, so maybe I would have liked that Kingdom Hearts, but it's Kingdom Hearts, so I probably wouldn't have liked it anyway.
I mean, the kind of card hand mechanic is seemingly quite a popular thing in the board gaming circuit at the minute. A friend of mine's recently picked up I think it was a Kickstarter project called Gloomhaven.
Okay.
And that's a sort of, I mean, it describes itself as a dungeon crawler, but it's a bit more like Descent, if anyone listening is familiar with that, in that you sort of have a predefined map rather than going and exploring, and it's different scenarios that you and your party go and do. And all of that is driven by cards. There's no dice rolling or anything in that. So each card has got things like an initiative value to determine how quickly someone moves, and there's some cards have move actions on them, some have special attacks and that sort of thing. So that seems to be quite a popular mechanic for people to experiment with at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, card anything is huge right now. I mean, people have warmed up so much to like gotcha elements in mobile games, and I think even if it's subconsciously, I think that's warmed a lot of people up to the way card-based gaming works as well. I mean, those of us who've played Magic our whole lives have been doing gotcha our whole lives, right? Buying booster packs. So it's all kind of the same mentality, and I think especially with the success of Hearthstone, really mainstream digital card-based gaming. Yeah,
definitely. So yeah, Hearthstone's a big one, and as you say, mobile games are huge for this sort of thing as well. And it helps that the kind of gacha games on mobile have kind of grown in complexity and interest now. So like I think back to 5 or 6 years ago when I was covering Facebook and social games. And the idea of card battle games that were coming out of Japan they were so simplistic. It was literally a case of collect the cards with the biggest numbers on them and you will win.
Yeah, I remember trying Rage of Bahamut and being like, why am I even playing this? There's no actual there's no decision making. There's no game here.
Yeah, absolutely. Whereas you compare that to something like Grand Blue Fantasy or Fate Grand Order now, and whatever you might think of the business model behind those, there's some definite interesting mechanics going on there now. So I think that's, as you say, that's helped people to sort of expand their horizons a bit and try more interesting things.
Yeah.
All right. Moving on then. This is going to be an interesting discussion, I think. So, Gematsu reports that Housemarque has announced a new game called Storm Divers, which is described as a high-flying and heavy-hitting multiplayer-centric experience that runs on a combination of the studio's in-house VFX engine and Unreal Engine 4 and uses Amazon's game tech server infrastructure. So, I love Housemarque's old stuff. It is proper sort of old-school arcade games with a modern coat of paint and glorious particle explosions and things shattering into voxels and that sort of thing. But I see a headline that says Housemarque announces multiplayer-centric anything, and I kind of cringe a bit. So What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I check out at multiplayer. If there's one thing that anyone will learn about me in these casts is I check out at multiplayer centric gaming. I also am a huge fan of Housemarque. I couldn't tell you how many hours I sunk into the original Super Stardust HD on the PS3. Absolutely love their design aesthetic, their approach to development. So when I read the news that this new game was coming, my initial response was, I can't wait to watch a couple videos of people playing this on YouTube and then never touch it myself. Like, I can't wait to see what it looks like because it's Housemarque, but I really have no desire to play it because it'll likely be exceedingly competitive, and that's just not where I go for. I'm not a competitive gamer in any way. I don't want to fight other people or shoot other people, or it's just not.
I mean, it is worth noting at the minute that all they've released so far is a teaser trailer that doesn't really give very much of an indication of what the game's going to be about. But I mean, judging from what I've seen in that trailer and the screenshots, it looks a bit bland.
I have no doubt, because by its very nature, multiplayer centric design requires some of the artistry of game design to be sucked out. Like you have to create something that is not geared toward the enjoyment of a single person. Once you create something that has to be open, you basically have to create a playground for participation, and that's very different from the artistry involved in developing a single player experience. So by their very definition, most multiplayer centric games have a blandness and a sameness to them.
I think that's kind of an interesting point though, because I mean, Housemarque's games have always been very mechanic centric anyway, and I'm not sure that I'm not sure that the multiplayer version necessarily has to be bland, because I mean, if you look back at like Resogun and Super Stardust and so on, the actual mechanics of those are very simple and would be easily adaptable to sort of a multiplayer format.
Sure.
I guess. But I think it's just more that like the images and the video I've seen so far, I mean, it's just things like the color palette and stuff looks very washed out, and I'm used to very sort of vibrant colors and sort of obviously inspired by our old arcade games and that sort of thing, and this just looks generic more than anything at the moment. I mean, I'm open to being pleasantly surprised, but
sure, I'm always open to being pleasantly surprised. I think my biggest concern really is with this new Housemarque game is, obviously I'm going to check it out because I like to see most games, even ones I'm not particularly interested in. But they made it very clear, not just in this event, but in a lot of interviews and stuff months ago, when they had made a line in the sand and said, we're done with arcade style games. Obviously anything they do in the future is going to have their unique touch to it, but it became very clear from them that they're no longer interested in doing what they used to do, because what they used to do has proved to not be financially viable. And what I worry about is, in chasing that kind of new directive to not do what they always used to do in hopes of hopefully being more successful financially, is they're going to lose sight of what made their games interesting in the first place. The artistic and the design-based decisions that made their games wholly unique. I feel like that's probably the first thing that's going to go, because they're going to, how can we make the next Overwatch? How can we make the next Fortnite? You know?
Right.
And now,
I mean, I guess that is one thing we can be grateful about, isn't it? They're not calling it a battle royale game, so that's one thing we can be thankful for, at least.
Sure. There's enough of those. Not that there's anything wrong with them if they're what you enjoy, but market saturation is not good for anybody.
All right, I'm going to head over to you again. What else you got for us?
Most of the news stories I had written down to talk about this week are mostly just me being angry about mobile games. So I'll actually flip-flop and talk about something mobile related that I am interested in, which is Another Eden, which is a mobile game that's gaining some popularity right now in Japan, which is actually considered by many to be a spiritual successor to the Chrono Cross and Chrono Trigger, is going to be coming to Switch. I don't know too much about the game in terms of gameplay. I don't know how the free-to-play elements factor in Japan, but the original writer is Masato Kato, who is the guy who wrote the story for Chrono Cross. He also worked on Chrono Trigger and Xenogears, and music is by Yasunori Mitsuda. So there's some real creative chops in this game, so it might be worth checking out. Always take things with a grain of salt when mobile transitions over to console, because once again, I don't know how things like DLC and free-to-play business are going to factor into what it is. But I always like to look back when I try to be optimistic about these things to the Nintendo DS version of Puzzle and Dragons, which I sunk about 100 hours into because it was just totally adapted with all the free-to-play business excised out, and it was a fully functional game. So if this Another Eden can make the transfer to console and be modified to be a console or handheld game without the free-to-play elements, I encourage everybody to Google it. The visuals are adorable, brightly colored. It looks like something worth playing. So hopefully this is good news.
Again, we're just going on screenshots here, but it's got a really lovely look to it. It's got a sort of almost a 2D side scroller look to the exploration sequences from the look of things. With sort of moving in and out of the screen and going side to side and that sort of thing. And that's kind of a style I really like. And the battle scenes look lovely. So
yeah, everything has kind of a glossy, like toy-like sheen to it. It's kind of almost like a fairy tale aesthetic. It's very cool. It's very neat, and I'd very much like to get my hands on it. Hopefully, it's not tainted with too much FTP garbage.
Well, I have to wait and see on that, I guess.
Yeah.
All right. So, last thing I want to cover then is Platinum Games apparently are interested in bringing the Wonderful 101 to Switch. Did you play the Wii U version at all?
I did, yes.
What do you think?
Not a fan. I love Platinum, but Wonderful 101 is probably my least favorite Platinum game, specifically because of the necessity of using the touchscreen.
Right.
So if a Switch version happens and they modify it in such a way that the touchscreen is no longer necessary, it could be an amazing game. Because I absolutely love a lot about Wonderful 101. I love the cheesy theme song. I obviously love the nods to Tokusatsu Hero. Like, the whole theme of it's beautiful. And the visuals in it are so distinct because it really just looks like you're mashing things around in a toy box. Yeah. And that's a really cool look that I really like in games when they look like toys. Captain Toad being another example. Any game that captures that like interactive toy box look is really special to me. So hopefully a Switch port of Wonderful 101 makes it something I can enjoy more.
Yeah, let's hope so. I mean, it'll be interesting to see how they handle it, because although the Switch has a touchscreen, I haven't actually come across many games that use it very much. There's only, I think, one I know of that actually requires you to play it in handheld mode and use the touchscreen, which is a music game that the name escapes me at the minute.
Voez, I think. I don't know.
Voez, that's the one. Yeah. Pronounce it. And I mean, that was a mobile port anyway, so well, that's not altogether surprising. But yeah, I'm yet to play a Switch game where you use the touchscreen at all, to be honest. So.
Well, you can't, right? You can't play it on a TV.
Well, exactly.
Docked, it's not possible. So.
All right. Okay. Anything else you want to bring up?
No. Castlevania, Grimoire of Souls, new Castlevania for mobile. I have no more mobile with an exclamation point. New Wild Arms mobile. New Castlevania mobile. So in the past month, my two favorite franchises in all of gaming period have crushed my dreams. At least there's some pretty new Ayami Kojima artwork, but I'm gonna play it because it's Castlevania, but I don't have high hopes because it's gonna be gacha, right? Like, it's already like the artwork has like 8 classic heroes on. It's clearly gonna be like, pump all your money in so you can maybe draw Alucard. Like, I'm not playing. I'm not playing Konami's game.
I'm just struggling to picture how that format will work with Castlevania. So, I mean, I guess you could unlock new characters and stuff that way, but I mean, it just doesn't seem like something that would naturally fit with it. But, I mean, there are gacha bullet hell games out there, so what do I know?
Yeah, I mean, who knows?
All right. So, that brings us to the end of our news segment. I think we're going to take a short break now, and we'll be back in just a moment with some discussion of the things we've been playing recently. So, we'll see you in a moment.
isn't life, doll.
What we need is a Sega. That's a games console. Plug me in and things will really liven up. You can get loads of Sega games like Outrun, Double Dragon, Shinobi,
Ghostbusters! And the graphics, well,
and you can buy extra bits like these.
3D.
Oh, you look
Weird.
Okay, do us a favour. Plug me into a Sega.
Now whack on the patches and I'll get back to sleep.
All right. Well, so let's have a discussion about what we're playing right now, / enjoying right now, because I probably got way too negative in the last block complaining about mobile ports.
Never. That doesn't sound like you.
No, right? So I am currently deep in my backlog playing the original Dragon Quest Heroes, which I absolutely love. Not just as a fan of Musou games, but also as a fan of Dragon Quest in general. And specifically, I really love Dragon Quest spin-off games because I find Akira Toriyama's artwork like super delightful and lovable. So like any game I can possibly play that has it in it, I love. So have you played Dragon Quest Heroes? I can't remember.
I have not. No, I own a copy, but I haven't fired it up yet, and I'm quite interested to hear a bit more about it because I like Musou games, but from what you've said of this, it's a little bit different to your standard format, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, let's hear a bit more about it.
It's not really a Musou game in the pure sense. Like that's kind of why they didn't call it Dragon Quest Warriors. Like it was a very specific effort to distance itself from that. So basically what they've done, and from what I understand, this gets even more intense in the second one, but I haven't played the second one yet, is what they've really done is taken kind of the 1 versus 100, whatever the classic cliche tagline of the Musou games is, and kind of tried to fuse that arcadey action with stronger RPG elements. So it's a lot like a Musou game in a lot of ways. You have a roster of characters who have different weapons, different fighting styles, different abilities, but as they level up, you actually get skill points that you can invest in customizing the characters in different ways. Enemies drop loot like in a standard RPG, and then you can actually there's an accessory creation and there's a hub where you get your missions and buy equipment, and you can create and meld accessories in different ways. You take on missions. Some of them are fetch quests, classic RPG style fetch quests to get certain numbers of loot or kill a certain number of X enemy, all very RPG quest. And the actual minute-to-minute gameplay takes the huge hordes of a classic Dynasty Warriors style game away. You're never usually fighting like 100 or 300 guys at once. There's still a lot of enemies on the screen, but it's a much more contained kind of thing. And there's larger boss monsters in the crowds that have bit stronger abilities and higher amounts of health, which I guess kind of works like the officers in the Musou games did, but they're big. They're big. It'll be like a dragon. And then there's tower defense elements. So like as you play the game, you'll monsters you kill will drop monster medals. And in those monster medals actually let you summon that monster as like a loyal sentry to defend the point you summon them to. So like in I'd say maybe 2/3 of the levels in the game, it'll be like, oh, okay, well here's a priestess in the temple. Like we have to defend the priestess. So as you play the game, you're running around the stage, taking the enemies out, and then collecting those monster medals, then running back to the priestess, summoning your golems and dragons and whatever to protect the priestess, then going back out to continue wiping the enemies out. But you have to ensure that like your mark is safe with those tower defense elements. So there's a lot of mechanical hooks in there that are different from your standard Musou game.
See, this sounds great. Why haven't I played this yet?
Yeah, it's quite good, and I'm about 35 hours deep into it now. I've beaten the main story. I'm just doing the end game stuff and like collecting ultimate weapons and stuff now. But it's rare that I sink that much time into an actual Musou game, and this is coming from someone who loves them quite a bit. And I don't usually put more than 15-20 hours into a Musou game because I do get tired of it after a while. But all the RPG hooks really drove me to continue playing this one.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a really interesting twist on it, and I'm glad they're kind of experimenting with the format a bit because, I mean, fair or not, one of the most common criticisms of the whole Musou genre, if you want to call it that, is that the games are sort of very similar to one another. But I think between stuff like this and Hyrule Warriors is a bit more of a traditional example in that you've got the sort of strategic stages, but then it's also got this adventure mode stuff in it as well, which is very different again in structure to what you described there. So I think it's good that they're finding different ways to experiment with the overall formula.
Yeah. And from what I understand, like I said, that the second Dragon Quest Heroes takes a lot of those RPG steps even further. Like, I guess there's classes for the main characters that you can switch between, like job classes. So I remember reading an article, I think it might have been on Kotaku or somewhere, where they basically said Dragon Quest Heroes 2 was like their surprise favorite RPG of the year. Like, the RPG elements in it had become so ingrained that it felt more like an action RPG, like an Ys or something, than it did a Musou game. So I'm really, really excited to check 2 out as well, even though I don't like the characters that they picked for 2 as much as the characters in 1.
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting one because, I mean, everything I've read about it seems that it's very well received and everything, but it's one of those ones that just doesn't seem to have been discussed very much at all.
Yeah. The spin-off games specifically kind of get brushed under the... I mean, I'm sure when Dragon Quest XI comes out this fall, everyone's going to be writing articles about it nonstop. But yeah, it's like when a game like Dragon Quest Heroes comes out, it's like I feel like everyone does their review and then it kind of doesn't get talked about again.
Right.
But I quite love it, and it's rare that I spend a lot of time in endgame in a game, so that should tell you how much I like it. Usually once I roll credits, I'm pretty much done with the game, but I'm trying to collect the ultimate weapons, trying to see how many more trophies I can milk out of it, which is not something I often do.
Yeah, well, sounds really cool. So is that been the extent of what you've been playing lately, or is there anything else in there as well?
I've been playing that, and I recently got to hang out with a good friend of mine who had bought Dragon Ball FighterZ. So I got to play that a little bit this weekend. That was excellent. Really, just every word of praise I've read about it so far is quite well deserved. It's a very intuitive fighting game, and you always feel like you're doing something cool. Like, even if you're just button mashing, you're zooming around, stuff's exploding everywhere. Like, it's makes you feel really powerful when you play it, which is what a good Dragon Ball game should do.
Right.
I mean, I can't...
How is it on the sort of accessibility front? Because, I mean, you know from previous discussions with me that sort of fighting games for me traditionally have been quite a sort of inaccessible genre for various reasons, but how easy is this one to get into, do you reckon?
Yeah, it's quite easy to get into. That's kind of what I was just speaking to, is no matter what you're doing, it looks cool and you're having a good time. Like, you may not be pulling off, like 32 hit chains and stuff, but there's a button just to do like that, like Dragon Ball, like light yourself on fire, rocket boost across the screen. Like, you just pull the trigger to make that happen, and it's like that instantly transitions into a juggle, which you can turn into a combo. Like, they made it really easy to not only do neat things regardless of your skill level, but really actually feel like you're like producing an episode of Dragon Ball. It's kind of cool.
That's cool. It sounds like a good balance between sort of something for Dragon Ball fans and something for fighting game fans as well. So sort of the Dragon Ball fans can get something out of all these cool moves they can do, but there's some mechanical depth there, definitely. I know the fighting game community in general is going nuts for it at the moment, so that's a good sign.
Yeah, it's and obviously, I don't know if you haven't seen it in action, it's visually one of the most striking games I've seen in years. It basically, Dragon Ball FighterZ looks in motion what, when I was 12 years old, I imagined video games looking like in 20 years. I was like, when I was a kid, I was like, one day games are going to look like interactive cartoons. And like, Dragon Ball FighterZ really is like that, like times 1,000. Like, it's unbelievable how smooth and crisp and colorful it is. And like, to be like the sensation of controlling that like animated action like so flawlessly, it's really quite something special. They've really hit the nail on the head with it.
Oh, good to hear the hype was deserved on that then. You got anything else for us?
No, I think that's it. I mean, I've been fiddling around playing arcade shooters in MAME a lot, but that's the same is true every day of my adult life, so there's nothing new there.
All right. Well, I mean, my gaming is generally determined by what I'm writing about this month, as you know. So most of my month has been taken up with Blue Reflection by Gust, which you can of course read more about on MoeGamer.net. But yeah, I'm really enjoying that. I'm coming up on the end of it now. You will absolutely hate it because it's so dialogue heavy. The main point of it is not the RPG point at all, which I think is quite an interesting approach. The main point is very much you are a 15-year-old girl going around doing 15-year-old girl things. Also, by the way, you're a magical girl and there are demons and stuff. But that latter aspect is a surprisingly minor part of the whole experience. The sort of appeal of it is the fact that it's got this really well realized little world, and it is a little world. It's pretty much just the school that you explore, and it's got these characters that you get to know over the course of it, and sort of all their personal stories sort of culminate and come to a head by the end of it. And there's this nice mechanic where in boss fights, all of the characters that you've been developing these bonds with, you can sort of equip them as supporters. It's like there's a narrative thing where when you've stabilized their emotional fragment and give them a special ring, then they don't freeze in time when these giant monsters appear, so that they can come and support you in combat.
I wish.
And each one of them's got this
my emotional fragment.
But then you'd have to fight giant tree monsters, so swings and roundabouts. But each one of these supporters has got this just wonderful, adorable animation that's unique to each of them, and it just captures their personality perfectly. So it's like one girl is like sort of the delinquent gamer girl, and like her special move is just like her chucking a can on the floor and then booting it as hard as she can at the boss, and it just looks ridiculous, but it's amazing. And there's another one who's like the beautiful girl of the school, and like she does her makeup in front of everyone, and that makes everyone feel better and that sort of thing. So
I really like stuff.
But yeah,
like
it's a really interesting game because they've obviously just gone, right, we want to do some unconventional shit with this, and they've just sort of run with it. Like the whole small scale of it and the presentation of it and things like the music and stuff. The music's amazing. It's quite unlike any game soundtrack I've heard at all, because it's got this strange blend of sort of blinky plonky relaxing sort of mood music with piano stuff, and then the battle theme sort of combines these really thrashing drum beats and sort of dubstep bass lines and stuff, and it's a really odd combination of things, but it works so well. And it's just really carved out this niche for itself, but absolutely no one has said anything about it online anywhere.
I remember it just came and passed with like I couldn't even really find many reviews of it when it launched.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, Gust isn't the biggest developer out there, but they usually get a bit of attention for things like the Atelier games and stuff like that. But this sort of came and went without any real fanfare at all. And I mean, it's got its flaws here and there. So like I say, people with sort of your taste in things and not preferring sort of very narrative heavy things, they'll probably find it quite boring. But it is a game that is worth experiencing just for all the unique things it does, I think.
Yeah, well, it's even I was able to immediately identify that it wasn't a game for me, basically just based on the fact that it was developed by Gust. But I did immediately fall in love with it visually. Visually, there's nothing like it, with the pastel tones and the softness, and there's a certain crispness to it. I'm a menu guy. I know we've talked about that in the past.
Yeah.
Like, I love user interface design, and will geek about games with good, like, beautiful user interface design. I don't like Persona. I buy every Persona game just to fiddle around in the menus. And that game is not quite on Persona's level, but it has a really unique visual design and like a preoccupation with diamonds, like beautifully slotted next to each other in like satisfying geometric arrangements, and like just watching footage of like a battle sequence and like the way the menus pop up and flip around, like it's clear, like you said, that they were interested in doing something very, very different, which like you mentioned in response to Dragon Quest Heroes, Omega Force gets lambasted a lot for doing the same thing over and over. And it's the same thing with Gust. People don't give Gust a lot of credit because people who aren't into the Atelier games feel that they're all the same thing. So it's really cool that they made a decision to do something with an extremely unique visual profile and some really, really cool gameplay hooks that sound like they tie into narrative in a really unique way. So even though I have no desire to play it, I do have to give it major props for being something that's clearly different from what else is on the market by that developer.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the interesting things about the aesthetic of it is that the character designer, Mel Kishida, is the same guy who did the Atelier Ireland games on the PS3, and yet it's got a much more distinctive style for that. And I mean, part of that is the better technology. So I mean, you mentioned how sharp it looks, and the whole game uses really, really high resolution textures for the backgrounds and things. So like you can do things like you can read the spines on books and stuff, and you can read the notices on walls and stuff. And on the PS4, that causes the frame rate to absolutely tank, but it looks amazing. And one thing I mentioned in my article about it this week is that the whole thing is just directed beautifully, like from a sort of cinematography perspective.
That's nice.
It's not so like I haven't played an Atelier game since the Ireland ones, to my shame, but the older ones of those had very sort of visual novel style conversation sequences that were sort of bust shots and talking heads and that sort of thing, even when it was real time cutscenes. Whereas this is using all sorts of interesting camera angles. It uses lighting. It's sort of like big climactic scenes are often at sunset on the school's roof, so there's like this lovely sort of bloom lighting effects coming from behind people and that sort of thing. And there's just a real sense that they've thought of the whole thing from almost like a filmmaking perspective as much as a game design perspective. And yeah, it just looks beautiful.
Yeah, it sounds like they really made an effort to highlight the drama aspect of the game by taking that cinematic approach.
Yeah,
essentially.
Definitely. And so at the other end of the spectrum then, next month's cover game on the site is going to be Galgun 2. But since I got the Switch version and can play it handheld, I cracked it open a little bit early to have a bit of a play at lunchtimes at work this week. And yeah, that's looking like being a lot of fun. And interestingly, first impressions are that it's a very different game to the first one. I mean, you didn't play the first one, did you?
No, I never got around to it.
So structurally, the first game was very much like a traditional sort of light gun rail shooter. So you generally had one or more different levels that you could go through. It would take you on a predefined path down them, and along the way, you'd get girls popping up in predictable locations each time. So you could sort of learn where they were. You could learn what their weak spots were. And so in theory, if you got good enough, you could do like a perfect run of the game. Galgun 2 takes a different approach in that I have a feeling it was originally designed for VR because it seems to have quite a bit in common with the Galgun VR that they released on Steam a while back. That was more sort of a tech demo because it didn't really have any like sort of narrative content or real game structure to it, whereas this is all first person perspective, and a lot of it is sort of interacting with the world by looking at things and then hitting the button to confirm that sort of thing. So it feels like it was a VR game at some point, but it's just been adapted to more conventional controllers.
Okay.
But it really works. So rather than being a set protagonist like you were in the first one, you are a self-insert in this case. So during some conversation scenes and things, you can look around and you can zoom in on things and you can sort of see what's going on elsewhere in the room while someone's talking to you. And then the levels themselves, they unfold from various different vantage points, and rather than moving a cursor around while the background moves for you, it's sort of almost a quasi first-person shooter type thing where you move your whole perspective around and the sight stays in the middle of the screen. So it gives it a very different feel to it. And then as you progress through each bit, you sort of move from predefined location to predefined location, and sometimes you have a choice of places to go and so on. And I haven't really got far enough to sort of look at how things like the relationship mechanics work and stuff, but it seems like they've sort of stripped out the stat-based stuff from the previous game, which had a sort of dating sim style thing where you had 4 stats and they went up and down according to who you interacted with and what items you used and so on. And they were only really relevant in one of the modes where you could basically date any of the female characters as well as the sort of main heroines of the narrative. In this one, it seems like each day in the game you receive a series of messages of sort of requests from people around the school to do stuff, and fulfilling those requests in various ways allows you to develop your relationships and so on, and then you can invite them out to do things and interact with them and that kind of thing, and you have to have them like you enough to invite them back to your room and that sort of thing. So yeah, it's looking like being an interestingly different game from the original, with a very different structure. So rather than playing it through like an arcade game, you've got a 20-day time limit basically in order to try and achieve whatever it is you're trying to achieve in it. I'm not far enough to say exactly what that's supposed to be yet, but yeah, it's looking like a good one.
Do the things you complete or unlock that you know of carry on to, like, if you don't achieve like the main goal of the 20-day limit, like do you get to carry progress forward into like the next loop kind of thing, like that kind of Groundhog Day style gaming?
I'm not sure. As I say, I haven't really got far enough to judge that yet, but it would surprise me if you didn't have that sort of thing, because the original Galgun had sort of stuff that carried over. There was a sort of meta game where you had to collect the profile information for all the characters in the game, and you did that by finding out what their name was, and then zooming in to take their 3 measurements. And in this one, I think you get phone numbers by completing these missions and so on. And I think stuff like that will carry across. And then later in the game, you have your tuny neighbour who knocks herself in her bedroom all the time. I think she upgrades your weapon and stuff as well. But I've not seen how that works yet. All I've had contact with her about so far is she went on a epic, lengthy rant about how good retro games are and how much she hates multiplayer games. So I, of course, immediately fell in love with her.
Can we invite her on the next episode?
For sure. So that's pretty much everything I've been playing lately. So anything else you want to add before we take another break?
No, I think that's about it. Like I said, I've been hardcore into Dragon Quest Heroes, and that's about the extent of it. I've been kind of lost since completing Xenoblade 2. Like that game consumed like 4.5 months of my life. So like I've really been bouncing between games a lot to try to like find something that snags me quite the same way. But like no Poppy, no sale. Like I'm having a lot of trouble finding something that I want to play quite as much as. It's been real hard for me to even consider digging into a new RPG, because it's just like part of me still wants to go back and do more endgame stuff in Xenoblade.
Yeah, I know the feeling. The daily struggle. It sits on me on my shelf and goes, you want to collect all the blades, don't you? But that way lies madness, I feel.
Yeah, you gotta know when to say when at some point.
Well, at least you can't pay for them, so we should probably be grateful for that. Anyway, let's take a short break, and then we'll be back in a moment to discuss our main topic of the episode.
My favorite, cats. If you want to stay gunk at jungle scum, if you want to slam dunk like Robinson, if you want to bring down the best in the world, or hit your lift on a pterodactyl, if you want to smash crashing monster hell or fry the demons with electric spells, if you want to be a Sega nut, get yourself a Cyber Racing. To be this good takes ages, honey.
Okay, so for this third segment, we are going to talk about a specific topic. And the stimulus for this discussion is a tweet by a game developer that I've had some contact with in the past. He's a guy called Sayama Mishra. I'm probably butchering that name there, but he's a developer from Australia, from a company called Witchbeam Games, and they made a wonderful shoot 'em up called Assault Android Cactus a while back. That is a wonderful game. But he tweeted out I think it was a slide from a recent GDC conference. And it was to do with Sega, and the image was a mind map of multiple keywords related to Sega. And he tweeted out with this caption saying, "Like and retweet if you associate none of these things with Sega anymore and haven't for some time." And so this mind map incorporated the words international, cool, tech savvy, vitality, independent, freedom, future, reckless, roguish, challenger, and youth. So I thought it might be interesting to discuss both what we think about Sega of today and what our associations with it from the past are, because I know we've both got quite strong feelings about definitely the Sega of the past. So
Sure.
what do you think of this tweet then? Do you associate any of those words with Sega anymore, or do you think they've evolved? Or
It's really hard to say. I mean, the one that stands out to me really is cool, but not probably in the sense that Sega wants me to associate cool with Sega. I just think about like I'm probably on the right track, agreeing with your developer friend here, in that a lot of these things are definitely things I associated with like Sega of the 90s, and basically the Sega that made hardware, that used to make like bold decisions. But there are still some things here. Independent, I feel, still applies quite strongly to Sega.
right.
I feel like Sega still makes Sega games. Like, they haven't really towed the line in a certain sense. Like, I feel like Sega's still very much interested in doing Sega's thing. I'm gonna see how many times I can say Sega in this segment. But you know what I'm saying? Like, a Sega game still feels like a Sega game, in the same way a Nintendo game still feels like a Nintendo game. And so I feel like maybe independence certainly still applies to them. I feel like they want to be cool, but forgot how. So cool applies to them, but like I said, probably not in the way they want.
Right.
Reckless. I don't know why any company would try to associate themselves with being reckless, but I think they are reckless, but once again, not in the way that they're probably trying to get us to think of them as reckless, in that, like, wow, Sega makes brash decisions. Like, no, like, Sega makes reckless decisions pretty consistently, and they don't often pay off for them. So it's not a positive thing that I currently associate reckless with Sega. Roguish in the same way as cool. I mean, yeah, Sonic has attitude, and Sonic's attitude was great in the 1990s, but Sonic's attitude is still stuck in the 1990s, and it doesn't really make sense in 2018 anymore. I love Sonic, but I don't know. I feel like...
Do you love Sonic, or do you love 90s Sonic?
No, I like Sonic. I like modern Sonic quite a bit. Sonic Generations, I thought, was an excellent game. I have yet to play Sonic Forces, but I'm very excited about it. No, I have a lot of respect for modern Sonic. I actually get in quite a bit of fights about that with people because it was very popular. It was very popular several years ago to have the hip, cool hipster kid. Video game journalists were all coming out of the woodwork and being like, "Newsflash, everybody! Sonic games were never good, so it's no surprise that they're not good now." Like, no, like, when it comes to game design, I try not to be a person who's extremely tethered to the past. So, like, I often understand what companies like Sega are doing when they decide. I mean, all of this is, of course, excluding Sonic Mania, which is obviously a nostalgia game. It was obviously trying to make 90s Sonic, but, like, experimenting with new mechanics and trying to bring Sonic into the modern age is what is necessary. It's what Nintendo also did with Mario. Just because Sega was less successful at it than Nintendo was at Mario doesn't mean they shouldn't be applauded for trying to translate the things that made Sonic interesting into modern tech. Like, I like experimenting with modern Sonic games. I think the feeling of speed is cool in modern Sonic games. Are they always mechanically tight and like 100% do what they're supposed to do? No, but I'm more apt to applaud developers for trying than I am to applaud them for acing what was safe.
Right. Do you think in that sense, do you think maybe Nintendo plays it a bit more safe with Mario than Sega do with Sonic?
I don't know if I would phrase it in terms of safe and not safe. I think both companies, in terms of translating their mascots into the modern era, attempted to identify what it was that defined those characters and then translate them as best as possible into modern mechanics and modern design philosophies. The things that defined Mario to a lot of people simply translated more seamlessly.
Right.
But I do feel like Mario has lost a bit of his identity in the modern age, because I go back and play old Mario games and they're balls hard. Like, Mario is tough. Like, it's tough to master old 8-bit and 16-bit Mario games. And so I guess there's an element of safety in modern Mario games. But I just feel like the things that defined Sonic were more about kind of image and experimentation and that feeling of speed. And like, Sega's done their best to translate those. So I don't think it's a matter of them playing it safe so much as the things they were literally trying to translate to the modern era are not safe things.
Right.
The speed is very difficult to convey correctly, no matter what era of tech you're working in. Like, so
right, and it's difficult to combine that with satisfying mechanics as well, isn't it? Because if you make something too fast to be controllable, then it's just not any fun, is it? So
yeah, but I mean, Sonic, what's that Wii U Sonic game, Lost World?
There's Sonic Colors is the one that everyone likes.
That's
and
the
then
Wii.
Lost World,
That's the last one on the Wii, Sonic Colors. Lost World is the Wii U exclusive.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
That game is unbelievable. It is one of the best platformers I've played in like the past 5 years. Like, it is beautiful. It has an unmatched aesthetic. It's a really bold looking game, and it plays beautifully. It's probably one of the most successful modern Sonic games in terms of translating some of the tenets of 2D Sonic to 3D. Like, the lock-on mechanics onto enemies and springs work better in that game than it has in other 3D Sonic games. Like, that game is tight, and it does amazing things with perspective and like interactive, like because it has the 3D worlds that you can like run around like anti-gravity, like Mario Galaxy style.
Right.
So it's like you're Sonic and you're running on a cylinder and you can run underneath the cylinder and stuff. Like, it was really cool. So like, I don't know, I'll defend that game strongly. And that was full of interesting design decisions, that bold design decisions that paid off. It was a really good game.
Yeah.
So that was both full of vitality, recklessness, freedom, coolness. So I think Sega really aims for these things on this list, and it may not always hit them.
I think part of the thing is I feel just like that Sega as a whole, it just isn't quite as visible as they used to be, which I think is part of the reason why people are saying that they don't associate a lot of these things with them.
But not having hardware will do that, right?
Exactly, but I mean, even Sega games, like you mentioned talking about recent Sega games, and I'm actually struggling to think of anything outside Sonic that was made by Sega. And I mean, I know I've played some. There was stuff like Binary Domain was Sega, wasn't it?
You're not a Valkyria guy. You don't play the Valkyria games. Those are Sega. Yeah. Those are Overworks. That's classic Sega. The Valkyria games are by the people who make Skies of Arcadia.
Right.
So that's Sega. Yakuza is Sega.
Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, besides a couple of those core franchises, they're not that, we don't get Choo Choo Rockets anymore. We don't get like Sega just cranking out games with interesting design ideas like we used to. But that's largely because they don't have the hardware to do it. When they could self-publish on their own hardware, they could make whatever the hell they wanted. Now they have to make safe stuff.
So I mean, that's part of it. I don't know if it's just like nostalgia blinding me or something, but like when I hear the word Sega now, I still think of like sort of 90s era Sega. Sure. I will forever sort of associate Sega primarily with arcade games rather than their consoles even, because that's basically what I grew up with.
Like Outrons and Afterburners and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. So like when I was a kid, whenever we'd go on a holiday down to the beach or whatever, because we don't really do sort of arcades anywhere other than the seaside over in this country, like going on holiday to the beach was exciting because it meant I got to go and play arcade games. So I would play stuff like Afterburner and G-Loc and Outrun and that sort of thing, all the stuff that there might have been home ports of, but the home ports at the time were absolute garbage in most cases.
Sure.
So and then there were things like sort of like the R360 version of G-Loc that with the ball thing you sat in and it went upside down and all sorts of things. And like this is still sort of the thing I associate Sega with even today. And I just feel like I I don't know if it's a hardware thing or not, but even like the modern Yakuza games and stuff like that, I don't associate them with that same Sega. I don't think of Yakuza as a Sega game. I think of it as a Yakuza game.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, Sega still does these things in Japan.
Yeah.
Like Border Break, that is coming to the PS4, that has like crazy arcade cabinets in Japan. Like not to the extent that they used to, but they're still experimenting with this kind of stuff. We just don't see it in the West.
Yeah,
because this is not the stuff for the West anymore. You know, but
that's a bit of a shame, I think, because I mean, Sega did used to have a semi-decent presence over here, and I mean, like I say, the UK's never been sort of particularly big on the arcades, but there were a few places around the place where Sega had like a dedicated arcade. Like even in the city where I live now, Southampton, we used to have a Sega World, they called it. It was basically a Sega-centric arcade, and they had a lot of Sega games there. And then down in London, in the Trocadero Centre, which is a big sort of high-end shopping centre, they had a huge Sega World there. That was where you'd go and play things like R360 and stuff. And there were sort of guest arcade games, like they had the full-size Ridge Racer with the like the roadster you could sit in and stuff there as well. Yeah, and it's a shame we don't get that kind of stuff anymore, I think, because, like you say, it's still going on in Japan, so it's kind of a bummer that we don't see that anymore.
I think when you talk about Sega as always really associating with Sega with either arcade games or arcadey, like arcade-style games, that's really when you hit the nail on the head about their lack of relevance today. Is because Sega, for many years, was a company very much associated with the arcade and developing mechanically simple arcade style experiences, like tightly designed mechanically simple arcade style experiences, which was of course a style of game that thrived in the 16-bit era, translated well to home console. Those types of experiences, with the exception of download games and like indie gaming, don't translate well to AAA or AA console gaming. Like, when you think back to like the classic Sega properties that you love the most, like none of those are translatable to modern double or AAA gaming in a way that's financially lucrative. Like, like boy oh boy, do I love me some oh goodness, I've lost the name of it. Fantasy Zone, right? Fantasy Zone is like one of my favorite games ever. But like, what does a modern Fantasy Zone look like? Yeah, it could be a $10 download, but that doesn't translate well. And I think that's probably a lot of the things that have made Sonic, it made it very difficult for Sonic to become relevant, right? Like Sonic is one of my favorite franchises to pick up and play when I have like 20 minutes to kill before I have to leave for work in the morning.
Yeah,
like
I was going to say, like an old Sonic game is something you could blast through in less than an hour, isn't it? So, and like there's no need for passwords or save games or anything, but
so when
there's this kind of
I was going to say, so when Sega's trying to make a modern game that isn't an RPG, what they really struggle with is how to take those small arcadey blast experiences and make them relevant into a 10, 15, 20, 25 hour game that someone's willing to pay $60 for. It's just not in their skill set.
That said, I have found it quite interesting over the last few years in particular that we're starting to see a bit of a revival of sort of the arcade style experience at retail.
Oh, for sure.
So I mean probably the best example of that is Puyo Puyo Tetris, which happens to be a Sega game. But then there's stuff like Soldam, there's stuff like Raiden 5. So we're starting to see a bit of a resurgence of people being willing to pick this stuff up, and I think there's also kind of an awareness that sort of the idea of the audience for digital games and physical games, they might have got it the wrong way round, in that people who are interested in these sort of I don't know if niche interest is the right word, but sort of things like arcade style games and things, the people who are into those games with the nostalgia side of things and so on, they are more willing to be able to go out and pick up a boxed copy of something rather than just having something in their Steam library or whatever that they'll forget about after 2 weeks or whatever.
No doubt. I mean, I'm actually more willing to buy those games physically than I am digitally.
Oh yeah,
like,
totally.
I don't think I would have bought Raiden 5 if it wasn't released in box in the store for me to get.
Yeah, exactly. Because I mean, I'm exactly the same. I know what I'm like. If I buy something digitally and it's not right in front of me on, I don't know, my PS4 start menu or whatever, then I'm going to forget I even own it after a while. It's like I've got so much stuff in my Steam library that occasionally I look through it and I think, oh, I bought that, did I?
Yeah.
And
so.
to me it just sort of devalues that a bit, in that I might have bought that on the strength of it looking cool and thought, oh, I'll get to it eventually. And I do that to a certain extent with physical games as well. But when I've got a physical game, it's there on my shelf. I can see it. I can look at it every day, and I can think, right, I should definitely get around to playing such and such that day. Whereas if it's lost in a digital library somewhere, or worse, sort of in my account and not even downloaded, then I mean it's easy to forget about those things.
Sure. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, Sega, but Sega, you know, like I said, Sega's classic roots in arcade, I think that probably is one of the linchpins to their struggles to stay modernly relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. But that said, I think they would make bank if they resurrected some of those arcade titles. Like, I would love to see a re-release of Outrun 2. I would love to see Afterburner Climax come back again. I would love to see more games given that the same treatment that Afterburner Climax had.
I would love.
And Afterburner Climax is one of those ones. Am I right in thinking you can't actually get that anymore? Can you?
I don't think so. I would love to see them do more of what they did with Sonic Mania, really, and or like get with someone who does. You know, there's so many companies out there nowadays who are making these beautiful 2D games that could only be possible in modern tech. Like, I think about how beautiful Shantae Half Genie Hero is, or I think about the recent Wonder Boy. Oh my God, how beautiful is that game? Like, many years ago, back on the PS2, Sega did their Sega Ages series, and they actually remade a lot of the games in 3D.
Yes, I remember those.
I would love to see something like that. Like, imagine a Fantasy Zone made in the style Lizard Cube made to remake Wonder Boy. Like a hand-drawn, beautiful world, taking the cartoon whimsy of Fantasy Zone, adapting it with modern tech. Like that, or why can't I remember the name of it? Oh, Space Harrier. What? Think of a classic arcade game that's more primed for like the new age of VR than Space Harrier.
Right.
Yeah. So like they could do 5 or 6 of those, make them tight arcadey experiences, pop them on the PlayStation Store for $10 a piece, or release a $59.99 compilation disc for us.
I'd buy it.
I would instantly buy it.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, now you've got me wanting g-loc VR.
My only experience with g-loc is that I have the Game Gear version of g-loc, which I would not recommend by any stretch of the imagination.
I don't think any home ports of that game were any good whatsoever. Like, even the ones on the more powerful consoles. And I think the Mega CD version was passable, but that was about it. None of them could quite manage it, because it was just an incredible experience in the arcade.
Sure.
It's even the sort of, even the not the R360 version, just the one with the sit down hydraulic cabinet was just so good. And I was always very frustrated back in the day that there was no reliable means of getting that to play at home. But I'd already been burned by Activision's version of Afterburner on the Atari ST, so I wasn't going to make that mistake again.
Those Jet Fighter, that's a whole genre that didn't translate well to home console for many years until like Ace Combat came around. Like Jet Fighter games on console.
Yeah, I mean, Jet Fighters was a strange one because there was a huge market for them in the 16-bit computer era. So sort of on the Amiga and Atari ST, there was a company called Microprose who made tons of flight sims. There was things like F-19 Stealth Fighter, F-15 Strike Eagle, and so on. Some of those even hit the arcades. I remember walking into an arcade and seeing a stand-up cabinet with F-15 Strike Eagle. And that was like an in-depth simulation with polygon graphics and all sorts. And it was like, well, that's the sort of thing I play on my ST at home. So there was a big market for that, but it's that genre sort of seemed to peak in about the PS2 era, I think. So like you said, there were the Ace Combat games. There's a couple of weird ass games from Taito that I haven't actually played yet, but I picked them up a while back called Energy Air Force. I don't know if you've heard of those at all.
No, I'm sure they're awesome though. I love Taito.
Yeah, they just sound really interesting because it sounds like they took like even more of a sim approach than Ace Combat did.
Oh, okay.
So those are going to be interesting to check out at some point. But yeah, anyway, basically they need to re-release Outrun 2, and that's the most important thing out of this whole discussion. I think
the first game I played when I got my Frame Meister and I got my SCART cables for my Xbox, the first thing I played was Outrun 2.
Oh, it's such a good game. It is. That game is peak Sega to me. It has all of the elements that I have always associated with Sega. It's got the sort of smooth movement. It's got the blue skies. It's got the happy chirpy music. It's got the arcade structure. That game, if someone asks me what is Sega, yeah, Outrun 2.
That's really interesting to hear you bring up like that you associate like a certain music style with Sega, because I think that's the same for a lot of people. I very acutely remember, I think it was on Hardcore Gaming 101, they had done a write-up on that Rhythm Thief game for I can't remember if that was for the DS or the 3DS. But one of the things that the author of that article had mentioned was that they always have associated with Sega, if not with coolness, then like a certain strive for coolness, and like how integral the integration and a specific approach to music is to Sega's approach, that like pretty much all the other like big houses don't have that same emphasis on music that Sega has. And like I really strongly agree with that. Like when I think of Sega, it's very difficult for me to think of Sega games without strong musical profiles associated with those games. Like Streets of Rage with Yuzo Koshiro's work. When I think of Fantasy Zone again, I always think of the music. I can't think of Outrun without having Magical Sound Shower pop into my head immediately. Like music and like the coolness of music have always been like an integral part of Sega's identity to me.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the things that I sort of think back so fondly on Sega is, music was a big part of it, but they definitely had a distinctive look and feel for their games as well, and I think that sort of started around the era of things like I keep bringing up g-loc, don't I? But I love g-loc. But one of the strangest things I associate with Sega is big numbers. I don't know if you know what I mean by this.
You'll have to elaborate.
Just like large numbers on screen. Like g-loc had an interface that took up quite a lot of the top of the screen. Like it had this massive score readout, and it had a massive timer that was counting down in milliseconds and so on. And that kind of look of sort of really exaggerating elements of the interface to make it very, very clear that you were playing a game, that you were playing an arcade game. They kind of carried that across right up until probably about the Dreamcast era or so.
Yeah.
So I think of something like Outrigger, which is a game that very few people have heard of, but I associate like that aesthetic with stuff right up to Outrigger and so on. Sort of big numbers on screen, exaggerated interface elements, sort of big flashing arrows telling you to aim here, to go this way, to do that. And I know we take the piss out of that to a certain extent in like modern Call of Duties and stuff, but those Sega games were designed for that sort of arcade immediacy, like that pick up and play thing. And I think the aesthetic was a big part of that. There was the appealing music, there was the sort of large friendly letters on screen and that kind of thing, and it was like a complete package that sort of welcomed you in to play those games.
Yeah, Sega's never been one to approach their game design under the auspices that like we're gonna try to create an immersive experience to you that you don't feel like you're playing a game. Like Sega's always, some developers these days are trying to escape the idea that they're playing, that it's a game, and they're trying to create an immersive experience. But like Sega has always been pretty comfortable reminding you that they make gamey games. Like mechanically rich, like you said, big numbers everywhere, like gamey games. Even if you play Valkyria, like you shoot, when you shoot the opponents, it's an RPG, right? So you've got the numbers pop up over their heads, and it's all like it reminds you that you're playing a game pretty consistently, and I enjoy that because I want to be playing it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, do we have a conclusion on our mind map of keywords related to Sega? What do we reckon?
Well, I think what I gather from it is that Sega has a clear picture of what they want to be and who they want to be, and Sega's fans have a very different perception of who they used to be and who they are now. And
Right.
I think there's probably a bit of a disconnect there that's not serving them. But
Do you think there's anything they could do to kind of fix that?
well, I think there's
Or do they need to fix it?
I don't think companies need to do everything their fans want them to do. like they have to do what, they have to do what feels right to them, and they have to continue to explore things in order to be financially viable. But at the same time, when you think about Sonic Mania, like that's an amazing game. Like, it was like they got people who were working on Sonic fan games to make this game, and it's one of their biggest success stories in years. So it's clear that they are in touch with what their fandom wants to a certain extent, and we're getting more and more Yakuza games in the West. Like 5 years ago, if you told me there was going to be a 6th Yakuza game and it was going to get confirmed for the West, I never would have agreed with you. Like I never would have thought that as a possibility. So I think more and more they're starting to listen to what their fans want and get in touch with that part of themselves. It's just hard to walk that line. Like, how do you walk that line between nostalgia and modernization? It's very difficult.
And I think in general, it's something a lot of companies have had to struggle with as they've got bigger. I mean, one of the most interesting examples I find is looking back on sort of Activision of the 80s and Activision of today, and they're basically completely different companies. Sega has obviously had to go through something very similar over the years with acquisitions and becoming more worldwide and that kind of thing. So,
but I don't know. I mean, when you bring up companies like Activision, who've obviously approached things very differently than Sega, like this whole mind map thing that we're looking at with these words on it kind of takes on a more positive spin. In comparison to someone like Activision or EA or any of these big companies that we come to associate with AAA gaming these days, they haven't been afraid to completely jettison their old identities in order to make big bank. Whereas I feel like Sega's always done its part to respect its history and do what its fans want to do to a certain extent. Like, have their games always been like the pinnacle of like 10 out of 10 quality in terms of like modern Sonic and stuff? No. Is Sonic still around? Yes. And the fact that Sonic is even still around, even though he hasn't always been successful, kind of says a lot to their desire to hold on to those old pieces of their core identity, which is not something we see from bigger AAA companies like Activision or EA or what have yous.
all right. Okay, that sounds like as good a place as any to tail off that discussion. So, thank you very much for listening to us talk for however long it's been now. Thank you, Chris, for joining me for this discussion. Do you want to tell people where to find you on the internet to check out your stuff and give you money?
Yeah. Yes, please give me money. No, I go by Mr. Gilder Pixels online pretty much everywhere. MrGilderPixels, and that's across Tumblr, Twitter, and Instagram. And I also have my website, MrGilderPixels.com. So I'm readily available. Follow me, shoot me some comments. I'd love to hear people are looking at my stuff and liking it. So love to hear from you.
Wonderful. And if you have come across this externally from my website, you can find all my writing about Japanese games and visual novels and all sorts of other stuff over at MoeGamer.net. That's MoeGamer.net. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.